John chapter 18 begins this new section. So we've gotten through Jesus' ministry specifically to the disciples. We started out with the miracles and signs and wonders and teaching that Jesus does. And now we've started in this courtroom setting. We're going to start out with a betrayal. We'll quickly move into a trial. And so I wanted to put this image up of a dark courtroom because I want us to recognize how important it is that we notice that the trial that Jesus went through was specifically unjust. It didn't make sense. No one thought it made sense. And yet, still, the Pharisees and the Sadducees pushed this trial through. So I want us to notice that as we begin in John chapter 18, especially in contrast to the previous 5 chapters where Jesus has been speaking to his disciples, speaking to his people, and telling them all that's going to happen. 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 is all about what Jesus is teaching to his disciples. But now the time has come for him to act this plan. And so I want us to notice this as we're starting the passion narrative, the passion of the Christ. This is all about the betrayal and the, air quotes, trial of Jesus. And so in verse 1, we get to see when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Not a very interesting start, right? But I think sometimes it's important for us to see the context for these things, because where does he go and where does he come from? Again, you can go ahead and zoom in, as I told you in the last lesson. If you want to, you can zoom in on this. Otherwise, you can Google a image of the Passion narrative and the Jerusalem city during that time, so you can see this a little bit clearer. But I think it's important. So if you're noticing, there's a lot of dates and things and names written on this screen. But if you're noticing down here in the bottom corner, you'll notice that it says Essene Corner. And you'll see right above it, High Priest's House. And right below it, the upper room, the traditional location for that. So notice, they're not very far apart. And Jesus winds up back in the high priest's house. But notice that he travels from the upper room where they've had this discussion, and as they're walking along, likely they're continuing this discussion that we read about already in the past 5 chapters, and now they have found themselves up in the Garden of Gethsemane, up here overlooking the temple. I want us to notice that simply because I think sometimes geography is important when we're noticing these things, because there's a lot of walking, a lot of time, a lot of space that has happened in this narrative that we don't read in. And so they go up and they arrest him because he's out of the city, he's out in the wilderness, in the dark. And so I want us to notice that that's happening because it just leads us a little more into how unjust and how much of a travesty this trial really becomes. And so, like I said, if you can't see that, go ahead and Google a Jerusalem map of 33 AD. That will give you kind of the idea of what you can look at there. Most of them looked the same. That was a Google image searched one. So John 18 verse 2 really begins where we're at today. It says, "Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples." And so notice that this betrayal is made even more personal, given that Judas knew that Jesus would return there with the disciples. And so this was a personal betrayal, even made more terrible due to Judas' close affiliation with the disciples. As we continue to read in verses 3 through 6, "So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, 'Whom do you seek?' They answered him, 'Jesus of Nazareth.' Jesus said to them, 'I am he.' Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, 'I am he,' they drew back and fell to the ground." Notice something that's happening here. Jesus is being arrested. Judas brings these soldiers to arrest Jesus, but not before Jesus has just astounded them with this statement, "I am." And in the original translation, this is referenced in the same way as the "I am" statement in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, I'll go ahead and read that really quickly for you all. God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So notice Jesus is saying the same thing here. He says, I am the one you're looking for. True, but I am so much more. And so they all fall down and they can't even stand in his presence. And so Jesus kind of takes charge and he says, so he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me? And so notice that Jesus shows that he's in charge of these events. He is not a victim in this. Those who seek to arrest him are not in charge of this event. He's not a victim in this text. This is his decision to save his people. Pulled that out of the Reformation Study Bible. Underneath that, it had a quote there, and I just thought that was so amazing. I kind of blew it up a little bit, but it's essentially the same thing. That it shows that Jesus is not a victim here, but he is Lord. He is king over this. And that aspect of king is about to play out even more clearly through the rest of this trial. Then we get into the weird connection of Annas and Caiaphas in 12 through 14. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Notice earlier on in several of the Gospels, if I remember correctly, that this man has said, oh yeah, it's better that one man should die than the whole nation. And he's saying it thinking, oh, well, we'll just kill this guy so the Romans don't invade us. But that's not what Jesus is thinking. That's not the plan of God. Annas and Caiaphas are part of this kind of weird high priestly family. This wasn't really supposed to happen, but they're occasionally removed and replaced by the Romans. And so that's why you see Annas, who's not actually the high priest at the time, it's Caiaphas, sometimes referred to as the high priest, because both carried much of that authority. And so notice that's kind of happening. So if you see, oh, the high priest is Annas, now it's Caiaphas, it's not any mistakes in the Bible, it's just how they're viewed at the time. These people would have seen them both kind of as that high priest role. Caiaphas would have been actually in the seat, but Annas was controlling much of that power as well. And so as we continue, according to the Mishnah, this is an ancient Jewish text just after Christ, this trial is terribly unjust. And these are some of the things that it did. It happened at night, which was not correct according to the Jewish law. It happened the day before a Sabbath, which you weren't allowed to do on a capital case. It involved false witnesses, which is always an issue. No real evidence is presented. And Jesus was physically assaulted during the trial. So as you can imagine today, none of this would fly. Of course, back then it may have been different, but we know from the Mishnah that that's not the case. They would not have been okay with this just 200 years later. And so this trial itself is false all the way down to its core. So I want you guys to notice that as well. And it serves to highlight the unjust nature of Jesus' betrayal and death at the hands of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Another thing that we notice in verses 15 through 18, and then we'll also jump ahead and read 25 through 27. These are the three accounts of Peter's denial. He says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Notice this disciple was likely John, so that's why his name isn't mentioned. He's talking about himself. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, so they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. So we'll see towards the end of the gospel, and especially in Acts, that Peter comes back and he repents of this sin of betraying Christ, of denying him. But we do want to notice that this happens exactly as Jesus has predicted. And that's more of a thing to hang on to because we're going to see that again later on. Verses 19 through 24 begins talking and then leads in 28 and to the end of the passage, begins talking about this trial. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who you have heard what I said to them. Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said." When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So notice what's happening. Jesus has clearly taught nothing worthy of being put to death throughout his ministry. Yes, there have been times where the Jews have accused him of blasphemy, but these have all been backed up by miracles. All those statements have been backed up by his miracles. That's the purpose of the book of signs that we started out the Gospel of John in John 2 through 12. So, as this is happening, the Jews bring Jesus to Pilate, apparently hoping that Pilate will kill Jesus for them. And Pilate does not see the case for Jesus and seems irritated to get involved in the Jewish affairs. Starting in verse 28, "Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover." Again, notice when the Passover is happening. This is unjust. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." So a couple of things to notice here before we continue is that Pilate is really saying something very logical. He's just saying, you don't charge him with anything. I'm not going to kill him just because you walked in and said, "Hey, can you kill this guy?" So Pilate's being very logical. But the Jews are saying, we're not allowed to put anything to death. And that's true because the Romans have outlawed that practice. They said, if it's a death case, bring him to us. You can whip him and beat him and do all kinds of stuff, but don't kill anyone, or you need to bring him to us to have that judgment be passed. So notice that is going on here. And then in verse 32 it says, "This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die." And notice that this is happening in a way that's fulfilling Jesus' own predictions. It says Jesus will die by being lifted up. John 3:14 is much less popular than John 3:16, and there's kind of a reason for that, because it's all about Jesus being killed. And it says in chapter 3, verse 14, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life." So what is going to happen to Jesus? He will be lifted up. Well, lifted up in death on the cross. It's a reference to being crucified, and the Jews would normally stone people. They would almost never have crucified someone. But the Romans did crucify, and that was their main mode of killing people if they were not Roman citizens. So pointing out that is really important to what is happening, because Jesus has predicted he will be lifted up. People didn't understand that, but it means that he will be killed on a cross for the sins of the world. And then we get into this interesting discussion between Pilate and Jesus. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." Notice there that he's saying, hey, Peter just lopped this guy's ear off, and I stopped him because this is not the plan. I am going to die. This is going to happen. Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" So Pilate asked about Jesus as king, and Jesus did not come the first time as a conquering king like Caesar, like the Roman emperor. He comes as much more. He comes as this kingly Messiah. He institutes a whole new system, not comes in to take over the original. So it's important that we recognize that Jesus is the Messiah in this story. Pilate asked this question, and this is frequently talked about, what is truth? Pilate did not really care about the law of the Jews. He didn't really have a connection to it, but simply wants this matter resolved through the normal justice system and channels. So notice he's applying what we would call a natural law, a justice, to this matter. And so he's saying that there's really no reason why we should kill him. And even though Pilate is rationally right, his rationality does not save him from serious involvement in the death of Jesus. Because he's saying, oh, well, it's not right that we kill this guy without a trial. But what does he wind up doing? Killing Jesus for no reason. And so notice that sometimes our rationality, we can outthink our own coverage. We can outthink ourselves in these matters. And so don't be like Pilate and just go along with what is told. Always seek to find God's will and what he has done in your life. And then last but not least, I think these verses are more important than we think. He says, Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Now, this is a bit of an under-translated term. Robber probably was not super accurate in the fullest sense. Yes, he was a robber. There were many things. But that term translated back down would be very close to terrorist, or somebody that was just chaotic. Murderer is used in some translations. And he is exchanged for Jesus, the Son of God. Notice here that it's unjust, but it's also a little bit of foreshadowing. Jesus, the Son of God, has died for sinners. And Jesus has been exchanged, put in our place for what we rightly deserve.